Hello, everyone. We'll get the last few people seated, and as everybody gets seated, I'll give you the standard disclaimers. First of all, I hope you had a great lunch, feel nourished, ready for a little story time, nice and relaxing. Well, I tend to be a little bit of a party pooper, unfortunately. When I go to parties, I really hate talking about my job because it's usually doom and gloom. So that's what you're getting. I'm sorry. I'm not. Also, this is a lot about trust. So, thank you for your trust in being here. I also need to trust you a little bit. One of the things I know for myself when I'm at a talk, it is that when I sit down, I'm like, ooh, I really need to go. I want to go do something else, but I don't want to get up because I'm afraid that the speaker will notice me and think I'm mad at them. Please take care of yourself. If you need to go, Jason Haddix is talking next room. He's a great guy. If you need to go do anything, please get up. I will not be mad. That's my spiel about trust. Thank you for taking care of yourself. Now for the not so much fun stuff. I love paradoxes. This talk, there's so much these last 2 days that's been about the fact that the world has changed. But the reality is nothing has really changed, but it really has. I don't know, does anybody love conflicting ideas that are both true? Yeah. This is so much fun. The amount of tension they create, beautiful. I'm really glad there's a fire extinguisher here because as far as I'm aware, our house is on fire and nobody's really talking about it. And you'll see why. And in the last couple of months, I've been trying to have conversations with people about things that are kind of difficult questions, like fundamental to how we do software engineering. And people don't really seem to love it because it's almost like you're picking a side, being right or wrong. And I really am getting a little bit frustrated with the fact that it's always you have to be on a side. So this talk is also about asking difficult questions. Because one of the things that has really bit us in the ass lately is how quickly we move as an industry. And the thing is, attackers really need to move fast. But when it comes to trust, it moves slowly. How many of you are familiar with the term fawning? I'm curious. One. Perfect. You all familiar with freeze, flight, fight? I see more heads. Great. Little thing. This is not tech related, but I hope that you might look it up later. Fawning is what happens when your source of safety is also your threat, the danger to you. And I think right now, and we'll see why, that the security industry is really telling us a story of like we're trying to make everything still be the same, but we are also acknowledging that everything has changed. Two more, then we'll actually get into some material. I also really want to think about dependencies, right? I think for me, when I think dependency, I think package.json. But what does dependency really mean? If you have studied psychology, you might think about codependency, right? Which is not so great. But we all have dependency on each other, right? For me to be here talking, I am dependent on you listening, right? That's fine. But it's also an act of trust, right? Whenever you put something into a package.json, you're trusting somebody, even though you don't realize. And I think the most heartbreaking thing for me is that we have been, in the last year, we've been lucky. But that's not a strategy. So, quick trip down memory lane. For me, this is not memory. I wasn't born then, but Ken Thompson, one of the sort of original computer science people, wrote this paper reflecting on trusting trust. And in the very subtitle, he asked the question, to what extent should one trust a statement that a program is free of Trojan horses? Perhaps it is more important to trust the people who wrote the software. And I think, especially now, this becomes a really interesting question, which we will get into in a little bit again, of like, what is trust? Do we trust the people? What if it's not even a person that wrote it? But yeah. So, one of the very first like really big supply chain attacks, right? This is all about supply chains that I was able to track down was this. Back in like 2002, somebody was able to compromise the binaries for OpenSSH. Right? They got onto the FTP server and replaced the binaries. Now, if you can't trust OpenSSH, what can you trust? Well, these were kids doing this. And it was really a warning sign, I think, of what was to come. Now, between 2002, it really took a while for this to become a serious issue. And especially when we talk about supply chains, right? I think by the numbers right now, I'm gonna just assume that I'm talking mostly about NPM, right? At Akita, we process, like we ingest all of the different registries, ecosystems. We're doing like 50,000 packages a day across them all. 80% of that is NPM. That is where the most damage has occurred kind of in these systems. So somebody was able to compromise the package called event stream, which was getting 2 million downloads a week. Right now, that's a bad Monday, unfortunately. And it was a couple of years later that somebody was able to compromise SolarWinds, right? Which was also a really big deal because it's used in a lot of governments. Now, this is a slightly different type of supply chain, right? Because we're not talking about open source, but still, this was a reminder of if you can get in through legitimate channels, right? Legitimate supply chains, the reach that you have is incredible, right? Because you're getting in through a trusted channel. A year later, we had the whole CodeCov incident, where I believe nation state was able to get in to a service that had everybody's code results, like code coverage results, and compromise that. That's a pretty big deal. This one here, I had to include it. It's not a supply chain attack per se. It was CrowdStrike. Everybody remember this when everything was shut down, like airports and stuff like that? Yeah, this was not a supply chain attack. This was just a configuration mistake. Right? But a good reminder of it doesn't need to be malicious, right? If we have dependencies underpinning everything, it doesn't matter if it was a mistake or if it was a malicious guy, it was like a beam from space going into the CPU at the wrong spot. Stuff can go wrong. And then I think one of the really interesting and kind of underrated incidents that's happened in the last couple of years has been the XC kind of infiltration, I guess you would call it. How many of you are familiar with this thing? Great. So, probably don't need to tell you, but this person, Jia Tan, spent years kind of cozying up to the maintainers of this library, which was basically a single guy. And eventually this guy kind of burns out and was like, Jia Tan was like, hey, I can take this over for you. And sure enough, he did that and put in a backdoor. Right? They played the long game to put a backdoor into, again, SSH. And they almost got away with it if it wasn't for a benchmarking guy at Microsoft. Like, he noticed that his SSH login sometimes took a little bit longer time than normal. I think it was benchmarking databases or something like that. It's like wild. Like this random guy at Microsoft caught it as the one guy. We got lucky. Thanks, guy. So even at this point, I'm kind of demoralized. I don't know, does any of you have some trust I can borrow? Because this was just the introduction. We're about to get to last year. One of the things you should know is that I write a lot of blog posts these days. And my therapist always kind of laughs at me when I come to a session. It's like, oh yeah, things have been on fire, but I'm okay because I wrote a blog post and I went dancing, and that's my therapy. Well, so this is also a little bit of a therapy session for me because, oh boy, last year was bad. It started out in April. I had just started at Aikido. They approached me and was like, hey, we're going to do this malware thing. I have no real background in malware, but I've in everything else, basically. And I was like, well, as far as I can tell, most published research suggests that most malicious packages are just security researchers, right? As somebody who's done a lot of bug bounty hunting, stuff like that, I'm very familiar with it. Right? It's not complicated. And yeah, the statistics all kind of showed majority of what you would see is that kind of activity. So I was like, cool, this will be easy, no big deal. Well, within a month, I was the first one to catch the fact that XRP or Ripple's JavaScript SDK was compromised. They put in a backdoor, here we go. They put in a backdoor into the JavaScript SDK that would send your private key off to a remote server. Pretty bad. How did it happen? Somebody leaked their NPM token. Oops. I mean, it can happen to everybody, but still, this is not a great thing to have happen. Not long after, see another big incident. This time, we caught a compromise of something called React Native ARIA. It's also called GlueStack commercially. These are components that you use for building sort of native apps, especially for mobile phones. And they were able to compromise all of these packages. They had a total of about 1 million downloads a week, which isn't that, 1 million downloads a week is a big number. But relatively speaking, it's not that much. Where it becomes concerning is that we especially saw within the Aikido customer base, this was heavily used by financial institutions, really big, high-impact kind of targets where you could do real damage. And how did they do it? Leaked token, again. Yeah. I didn't know two-factor authentication either. This is something of a trend. I think in the case of Ripple, it was specifically phishing, which again, phishing happens. But, of course, when it rains, it pours. This was a really fun day. This was when I think, for myself, I was like, oh, okay. I don't like where this is going. How many of you have heard of NX? A couple? Okay. About a third. So it's kind of like a package manager kind of system. And they, of course, got compromised. So this was a big deal because of a couple of things, and we're going to go through some of the technical details of why this was such a fascinating and really unsettling attack. The first part of what was really interesting was how they actually managed to compromise the packages. I don't know how many of you have gone to any of the talks, just like the previous one in here, about prompt injection in CI/CD. We also heard a lot of talk today and yesterday about GitHub Actions and all of these agents that you can do. Well, in this case, they just got in through a vulnerable sort of GitHub action, right, the CI/CD system, and was able to pull out the NPM token. It was just a normal command injection. It wasn't even AI yet. Thank God. Yeah, well, yes, there's still AI involved, unfortunately. Way to spoil it. Yeah, this was not a sophisticated, well, it was sophisticated in the fact that they were able to use GitHub's tools, right, search, to find a command injection, right? They were able to scan all of GitHub. People do this quite easily. And notice that NX had a vulnerable workflow. And I think it was actually this one that it only took like a couple of days, specifically, from when it was introduced until it was compromised. Like the time to compromise was really short. So let's get into some of the things that made this super interesting. This is where the AI stuff comes in. One of the things that it did was that once you got compromised, it would look through your system for secrets. It, of course, had some hard-coded paths and things like that it would look through environment variables. But it would also check if you had either Claude, Gemini, or Q installed. Then it would start it in an unsafe mode, so it accesses your full system. And then it had a prompt saying, hey, go through this system and find all the secrets. All right? So the fact that you have an LLM agent with access to a system, they're basically using that against you now. Right? They're using a piece of software that allows programming through natural language in a non-deterministic way to work against you. Great. There was also this really interesting decision that they made that when they infected your system, in your shell profile, they added a shutdown command. Why would you do that? I think this was one of the reasons why we caught it quickly as a community. If it wasn't for this, this would have taken a lot longer. The reason why people noticed was because the machine started to shut down. It's almost like they wanted to be caught. And I kind of think they did. Because what really changed, what made this such a different attack from what we've seen before, is what they did with exfiltration. What happened was that if you had a GitHub token in your local environment, they would, of course, scan your system for secrets. They would bundle that together. They would create a new public repository in your account and upload it there. No C2 infrastructure from their side. They just need to pull the GitHub live feed for new repositories with a specific description. That is their drop. That is how they ship secrets out. Not just to themselves. There was no encryption, right? They could have added asymmetric encryption in a way that only they could use the data. They were very capable of doing that. They didn't. And I think that says a lot. These are chaotically evil people in many ways. Or good, depending on how you look at it. So it's getting complicated. And then after a while, because everybody's GitHub secrets were now public, they decided, oh, do you have access to private repositories? We're going to turn those public. This is literally Robin Hood. What the? Git Guardian has done some really good coverage, and I'm going to be showing a bunch of other companies that have done really good research. One of the pieces here that I think is interesting is that there was about 1,400 public GitHub repositories that were created with secrets. And when they validated those, they found about 1,100 of those were still valid. That's a significant amount. And there was also an ability for them to turn it into about 82,901 additional secrets through the repositories that they turned from private to public, right? Because people check in secrets in private repositories, which is questionable, but let's not go there. It's a different talk. So this is it was such a fascinating attack because we have not seen a big breach like this with this kind of MO. We're like, what is the game? What are they trying to do other than cause chaos? Right? It really felt like they just wanted to see the world burn. Unfortunately, it's also genius. How many of you have seen this documentary? Oh, I love you. This is one of the best documentaries. It's about Robert McNamara and his involvement in as the, what's it called? Ministry of DOD. Yeah, he was the Secretary of Defense during the Vietnam War. And this documentary, he's looking back at his involvement in the war and how important the fog of war was, right? What happens when things are not clear, right? The fog, you can't see what's going on, and all the uncertainty that creates. And I think that's one of the devious things that these people have managed to do, and you'll see this occur again later, because they just put it out there for everybody to see. There is no way of doing attribution. They didn't have their own C2 infrastructure. They didn't drop it into their own infrastructure. So if anybody had credentials abused, there's no way of telling who did it. You can't connect the two. It could be them, it could be somebody else, who knows? And this really messes with things, especially from an investigative or law enforcement perspective, which is a whole different topic of the fact that there's been very little law enforcement investigation into this, from what I can tell. But anyway, let's not get caught down because there's way more stuff to go. A couple months later, well, a couple of weeks later, we had this thing going on, which was 18 really popular packages, actually some of the most popular packages on NPM, were compromised. They accounted for about 2.6 billion downloads a month. Debug, Chalk, ANSI, Color, all these ones. What do you think they did? They tried to go for crypto. They were really clever about how they tried to steal crypto. They would hook some of the APIs in the browser, and if they saw what looked like a crypto transaction, they would replace the actual address with one that looked kind of similar so that you didn't notice that it was being changed in the middle. Yeah, that was a really interesting attack. It was also completely useless. Like, as far as I'm aware, nobody was really impacted by this. No crypto was stolen, as far as I'm aware. We got really lucky. Again, luck is not a strategy. So 2.6 billion downloads a week. In the time that these packages were alive, 2.6 million downloads. Wiz did some really great research showing that 99% of the cloud environments that they monitor used one of these packages. 99% penetration. That's insane. 10% of those, within 2 hours, had a malicious version locally. 2 hours. We were really lucky by the fact that, well, we weren't lucky. I ended up talking to the guy that was phished in this case, Josh Junan. I was really lucky with my colleague Mackenzie that we actually were able to sit down and talk to him. He decided that he doesn't really want to use Twitter anymore, so he only uses Blue Sky. And I was really lucky. I had an account and could notify him because he was just about to head out for an appointment and would not have looked on any device for hours. If that had not occurred, it would have been hours longer. Because there's no really good way of getting hold of NPM. It usually takes days for them to take packages down. So that was kind of scary. Like, again, talking about blog posting as therapy, afterwards I was like, we got really lucky. Like, we need to process this. Because if the attackers that hit NX had done the same, this would have been a different situation, right? I was talking to a journalist and was like quietly saying, like, yeah, I really don't, like, I worry to even think about a scenario where they had done the same sort of evil way of doing things. They were just, I mean, I don't know if even these people realized that this was, they hit the mother lode, like the one person in the whole ecosystem that could cause the maximum damage. So in the conversation with Joss, there was some interesting insights that I think are also worth talking about from an open source perspective. One is that he never actually meant to get into open source. The fact that his packages are some of the most popular is purely coincidence. He wrote them like 10 years ago as side projects. He doesn't even do active development anymore. He's a Rust guy now. He was like, yeah, I got an email and it said I should change my two-factor, whatever it was. And it's like, yeah, I haven't touched NPM in a long time. But I guess I'll do it because I'm very security conscious. Right? The fact that he's trying to do the right thing got him compromised. There's also this thing of when you get compromised like this, they take control of your account. So it was really not an easy way for him to remediate this. And NPM support was really not that great. So that's really a very tricky kind of emotional thing of when you lose control over something, you still feel responsible. And he had no way of really doing anything. And I find it to be so interesting that when we think about open source, we don't really consider that there's a human behind it. And they might not even, they're probably not getting paid for this, right? This is a side project. But still, when something like this happens, Josh, very friendly, he admitted he fucked up. And do you know how much vulnerability that takes? To go in front of yeah, shit, I fucked up. That's heavy. If you go and check out the conversation, yeah, it really messed with him. And that sucks. But I think it also highlighted something really interesting, which is that I think there's a lot of trust to be built through vulnerability. And again, we all know about vulnerabilities, right? CVE. But what is vulnerability? If you think about vulnerability between two people, when was the last time you had a really vulnerable conversation with somebody? I think that's also one of the things that are really important as a lens to see through. How do we actually work together, right? These are not just bits and bytes. These are dependencies between us in many ways, right? If you get compromised, I get compromised. I really recommend checking out the interview we did with him. I thought it was really beautiful. So, at this point, I need to just spoil a little bit. I'm going to talk about Singularity, NX, SHA-Halut, SHA-1-Halut, all the same thing, but I'll use them kind of interchangeably. But before that, we didn't dodge a bullet, they missed. And that's, again, not a good strategy to have your attacker miss you. You can't rely on that. Because what happened? They struck again, right? This time they targeted, well, they didn't target actually, but very quickly when what ended up being called SHA-Halut happened, was that they compromised 180 plus packages in a very short amount of time. And this was when we had to add the word worm to our vocabulary within NPM, or sort of open source ecosystem contexts. And of course, there's some great memes if you go on Twitter and stuff like that. But yeah, this was not a great week. One of the fun things is, I talked about CrowdStrike earlier. One of the first things I saw was, why is this package from CrowdStrike showing up as malicious? That's not great. And that one was when panic happened for me. This is a timeline that you can see. Well, what you'll find is that actually this attack, the SHA-Halut attack, which was really the wormy bit. How many have watched Dune? The movie Dune? Wow, okay. I feel left out now, I haven't. And I talk about this all the time. Oops. What was really fascinating, because I spent days and days in sort of the aftermath of this whole thing, figuring out what the hell happened? How could this happen? So I put together a timeline of what did they do? How were they able to compromise so many packages? And what we saw was that actually the first compromised package was called like RxNT authentication. And they put out a bunch of versions within some hours, and they all were slightly different. They were debugging their code in production. Get that. Debugging their worms live. This is not nation state. Let's just make that clear. They had some really bad bugs, and they still do, which is why we can actually tell what they did. Because the way that they make the packages that they distribute to NPM, when it is through what you call community spread, they use the native like tar sort of command line tool, which includes metadata, which the npm package command does not do. So we can tell who did it, because it will say Kali. Everybody familiar with Kali? The Linux distribution for hacking tools and stuff? Yeah, that was really nice of them. Also, when they changed the package.json, they added an extra one. So now there's 2 package.jsons, so we can tell what was messed with. I love that. I actually wrote a blog post about it. I was like, hey guys, you have some bugs in your code. They didn't fix it, even in the next one, which I'm quite happy about. So you see that for some hours, like 4 or 5 hours, they're kind of messing about. And then the first real package that they go for with any amount of download is called NGX Bootstrap. This is a quite popular package. And that kind of started to get community spread going a little bit. It took some hours. The next one after that was about 3.5 hours later that somebody through community spread actually got compromised. And then after that, we start to see like a slow and steady kind of spread. We see like the native script community packages getting compromised. They put out another package with some more bug fixes. And then like 4 hours later, you see the package tinycolor, which is really popular, also compromised. And from this point on, it takes a couple of hours. Now CrowdStrike is compromised and a ton of other big packages. So I thought that was really interesting to see, like, these guys kind of YOLOing, which is concerning. Like, you don't want a self-spreading worm that's actually buggy as well. Now, they changed a bunch of things, right? They weren't idle in the time from the first attack, Singularity, into Shai-Hulud. The whole LLM thing didn't work. So they decided to use TruffleHawk instead. How many of you know TruffleHawk? Nice. TruffleHawk is a really great tool for finding secrets. Now, this is not a great use of TruffleHawk because we don't like our secrets being published on GitHub, but they decided, let's just download TruffleHawk and use that to scan the local system. Clever. Of course, the media started to go like, oh, the malicious tool TruffleHawk. It's like, come on, no. That's not how it works. The other thing they decided to do is like, oh yeah, a lot of people will have like cloud credentials. So why don't we just bundle in, like these files became like 10 megs, like the actual malicious blob, about 10 megs, because they need AWS, Google Cloud as dependencies. So they would see if you have credentials, then they would use that to try to see what other credentials can you access through like the secret managers and stuff like that. Perfect. Like automated recon in my worm, love it. Like, because at that point you can just pivot pretty easily. Like once you start to have like all the cloud credentials, yeah, you're very close to like really sensitive systems. And that's one of the insights that I think really started to dawn on people. It is that people are not necessarily, well, I say people, attackers, they're not necessarily going for the production systems anymore because they know they're really hardened. Why don't you go for the developers that have the secrets anyway and the source code and the direct way in? They're not as heavily monitored, right? They will have pseudo access like administrator credentials and privileges. That's a much better way of doing it. And also, sometimes they have crypto wallets, like especially like we saw with the debug chalk kind of compromise. So we're going for crypto, which is a very common strategy, especially for like the North Koreans. And sometimes it really pays off. So, yeah, at this point, I was starting to lose a little bit of sleep because it's like, they've hit us twice in less than a month. What's next, right? The amount of secrets that they got, significant. And sure enough, a couple of weeks later, they do it again. In this case, they managed to compromise a lot more packages. I think it got closer to 1,000 packages, and it spread quite quickly. They managed to hit Zapier, Async API, Postdoc, Postman, like all of these big companies. And they got it really quickly because they really honed their craft at this point. And again, how did they do it? CI/CD, GitHub Actions, command injections. Nothing complicated. It's just opaque, right? How many of you have your GitHub Actions as kind of version controlled or like have gates for it in the same way that you have like if you need to change something about your internal CI/CD server, right? Upgrading patches, stuff like that. I'm guessing you can check in a GitHub Action a lot easier than you can upgrading your build server, would be my guess. Because it's not hosted inside, but it has a lot of the same access because of the credentials you give to it. So it kind of lives in this interesting, weird in-between place very often that makes people think or be less diligent about how they use it. Like again, I will refer to the talks from McKinsey earlier about kind of prompt injection CI/CD and just how prevalent attacks for CI/CD have become, because they also integrate together with untrusted input through GitHub issues, GitHub pull requests, things like that. It's all blending together. And the threat model there is something I think people are not used to at this point. So they were able to compromise these really big packages. And of course, they brought new toys. One of them was if they had access to a GitHub repository, they would try to add a new GitHub action that acted as a backdoor on your local machine by installing a local GitHub runner. So now they're using GitHub Actions as a reverse shell into your machine. No C2 infrastructure. Isn't that beautiful? They also did this really evil thing, which was, you remember how they would distribute credentials through public repositories that would create for you if you had a GitHub token? Well, this time, you don't even need to have a GitHub token in your environment for them to exfiltrate. Because what they would do is if you did not have a GitHub token, they would use the GitHub public API to search for other compromised repositories with credentials. They would take the GitHub token out of it and use that. So you were using somebody else's GitHub credentials to leak your secrets. I love what Git Guardian called it, exfiltration mutualization. Sharing is caring is what it means. And I don't like it. I like my credentials to be mine. It also really confused us, actually, because we were like, why is this single user like making so many repositories? And of course, it took us a while, the whole fog of war thing, to realize these were not from the same user just infecting themselves over and over again. These were all different people, which made attribution and tracking down who does this belong to a lot more complicated. And this will become really relevant shortly. So in this breach, there was about 33,000 secrets exposed, and I think those were mostly validated ones. But then there was another about 300,000 credentials that were also accessible through sort of the secondary paths of like what those credentials could give you access to. And of those, when Git Guardian were able to go through and validate it, about 3,700 or something of those were still valid. That's a lot of tokens, and you don't know who they belong to. There's also this really cool graph about the actual spread. You'll see for like the first 12 hours, the spread is really high, and then it kind of dies down. But you do still really have a long tail. I don't have a slide for this, but Wiz ended up doing some really cool research about that long tail of leaked credentials. Where did it come from? And it actually came from if you see async API, one of the things that I actually probably should have added, but I didn't, was they didn't just compromise an NPM package this time. The first strike was that they compromised the OpenVSX. People familiar with OpenVSX? Yeah, it's the sort of open version of the VS Code marketplace for like Cursor and all these other ecosystems. They were able to compromise the credentials for that package too, put a backdoor into that. Right? So this is now actually touching two ecosystems. And how they work with like taking down packages is very different, well, extensions. And because there's no way of easily downgrading those packages, you had a lot of sort of compromised machines out there, right? Still the malicious version, even though it's been removed, was running. And that was just continuously trickling in like a few like sets of credentials like on an ongoing basis. Because your VS Code and your Cursor never told you that that package was compromised. It just didn't exist anymore. Now, these guys, they blow my mind sometimes. Like, well, when I say guys, I actually think it's probably just a single person. They did, again, something that's like evil genius level. Like, I kind of wish I was this sadistic. They realized, well, the second that Microsoft or GitHub decides to do something to stop our distribution through GitHub, we're toast. So they really put GitHub in a difficult position. What they did was, you remember how I talked about if you didn't have GitHub credentials, it would go look for them in GitHub search to then use those leaked credentials? Well, what they did was they said, if we do not find any credentials on GitHub for us to use, we're going to wipe people's machines. We're going to delete their home directory. So now, if you're GitHub and you want to really stop this distribution of credentials, you have this choice. You can stop the distribution of credentials and nuke people's machines, or you can keep it going. Think about that. What do you do? Like, what would you do?
Gives them a open credential.
Yeah, but it still validates them. Well, if it can't access anything, then it just wipes. Right? So it goes through like the first, like I think it was like 100 pages and validates until it finds one, and then if it just doesn't find any, it just wipes. Now, if you're a GitHub engineer, you're having to not only design, ship some mitigation into production really quickly, you also have to think about this. Like, how do we build a system that hopefully gets around some edge case in this logic to minimize damage? That's not an easy kind of situation to be in when time is so important, because everybody's credentials were being leaked. Well, everybody, not everybody. People using NPM, which is a lot. One of the things that is maybe a little bit unfortunate sometimes is that there's not a lot of good reporting on what they did with the stolen credentials. The one I really found that was good was from trigger.dev. And what they observed was that somebody, again, fog of war, we don't know if it's the same people, used the leaked credentials. They went and downloaded all the repositories over a period of time, and then they deleted all their private repositories. Like, they literally wiped them out. They were also looking kind of in real time, spying on the engineers to see when they were active, so they could blend in a little bit. It's kind of clever. This was such a great write-up. There was no pressure for them to do this, so I really respect the fact that they were so upfront about what happened. Because if it wasn't for them, we wouldn't have as much insight into the consequences. And they can't have been the only ones, right? I've seen all the major IT tech companies, right, Fortune 500, they were all in the breach list. Like, all of them had credentials more or less leaked. We just don't hear about what happened. Now, at this point, the actual damage, right? You have the people stealing crypto, especially North Koreans. Yeah, you can measure that in like money, because you're taking something. But with this attack, the real impact is the lost productivity, it's the stress, it's the more the human cost of like, shit, doing a lot of overtime, the panic, sort of the mental health cost of like, shit, everything is on fire. Like, this is a really difficult situation. But that changed at the end of last year. Because suddenly, this headline came out. $8.5 million in crypto were stolen from, through a extension called Trust Wallet. It's owned by Binance, so quite a big deal. And they were able to, again, distribute a compromised extension of the Trust Wallet sort of Chrome extension that would steal your secrets. And they did that on December 31st. That's a great day to do it because, well, either everybody is drunk or passed out or blowing up things. Well, they also blew up things. They stole $8.5 million. And again, we have no clue if it was the same people because the fog of war, there's no way of doing attribution. It was a free-for-all. And it took more than a month for the initial credentials to have been compromised until it was used. And they knew they had been compromised, they just didn't rotate all the secrets. Oops. So, I hope you're not all thinking, oh, we should just unplug from the internet. Don't want any worms. Unfortunately, I have bad news. We have designed, in my opinion, an ecosystem that will inherently create this type of behavior because we have optimized for three things. Speed, right? LLMs are so fast also. Automation, we don't want to do a lot. We just want to press button, get code. We have also really optimized for scale, right? Being effective. These are all things that you need for a very effective worm, right? The fact that we're going so fast gives very little time for anybody to go, are you sure this is a good idea? Right? As a security person, I'm so used to being the person who goes, slow down a little bit. Let's just, and then the developers go, no, we have a deadline to make. Like, we're already past deadline. And I'm like, yeah, sorry, but like, yeah, I'm usually the bad cop. And there's a reason why that sometimes is needed. Because otherwise you get really bad situations like this. The even worse thing is, I don't know that this is changeable like it is today. But I'm really curious how it could be different. If we come back to the Ken Thompson paper, he kind of ends that paper about trust, right? He starts out by saying, you cannot reason your way out of saying whether or not a piece of software has a Trojan horse in it or not. That is ultimately impossible. Maybe the real question is, do you trust the people who wrote it? And actually, you'll see here, he says, you can't trust the code you did not totally create yourself, especially not if the code comes from companies that employ people like himself. Which is a sad state of affairs. Who can we trust then? Really, I think one of the important things to come from this is that we have to be mindful about the dependencies that we have and whether or not there's alignment. and whether or not we are willing to outsource some of the risk and responsibility to other people. I think in many ways, open source can kind of be seen as a little bit of trust washing, right? If ever you've ever dealt with auditors and stuff like that, they will go through all your software, see how do you produce it and stuff like that. But when it's open source, it's like, yep, can't say anything about that because it's not made here. That's kind of clever, right? Somebody else's problem until it's yours. How do you know that Josh Junan, the guy from earlier, doesn't get tired and gives all of his packages to Geotan by accident? So to wrap this up, I have a bunch of questions, and I want to talk these through with you. I'm going to make a couple of assumptions up front. First one is that LLMs have changed everything, and that pretty soon, again, if you talked to me about 3-4 months ago, I would be like, no. But now I'm like, yeah, this is probably true. Very soon, software will be primarily produced by LLMs. And it's probably sooner than I expect. And the velocity and the volume of code they're going to be producing is exponential. A lot of slop, usually. So with these assumptions in place, and humor me even if you disagree, the first question is, what is the role of trust in open source? Does identity start to become important, right? If you have a dependency on a package, should you be caring about who the maintainer is? Can you establish who it is? If you can't, should you use it? And if it's all written by LLMs, what is the identity? Does the identity associate with the person pushing the button? Is it the LLM that is the identity you need to trust? Like, for me, this whole identity problem actually, I think the meritocracy of open source is really interesting, right? That's been so much of the underpinning of especially hacker culture also. But that doesn't scale at some point. And especially once you start to ask the question of, do LLMs have agency? Right? OpenClaw and all that sort of stuff starts to raise some interesting questions there of who makes decisions and who's responsible for the actions that might ultimately occur. The second question is about trust. One of the things that you saw was that a package could be published and instantly, well, within minutes to hours, it can be all over the internet. Is that smart? PNPM, which is another package manager, was really clever, and actually after, I think, Singularity, the first attack, they introduced a feature that's saying, hey, if there's a package that's been published within 24 hours, skip it for now. Take the previous version. And that's really clever, slowing things down, giving you that window for the community to basically make a judgment of, do we think this is safe? Right? At Aikido, we pull in all of the packages that are published every day, 50,000 a day. And within 15 minutes, we've done analysis of it and can make a pretty good decision on whether or not this is trustworthy. Maybe it's good if things slow down a little bit so that the ecosystem has time to react and act as a little bit of an immune system. Besides the fact that even then we're waiting for NPM to take down a package, and that takes usually 24 to 48 hours. But still, 24 hours is much better than 0. And there's also this question of, if you actually just pull in a package the second that it's published, is that maybe negligent? Can you reasonably have done any due diligence to verify that whatever was updated in this version is safe and in your interest? And when it comes to the whole LLM thing, it's pretty clear that if you're dealing with LLMs, you must assume things will go wrong, right? It will go off the deep end and do crazy things. It makes it so that everything becomes kind of non-deterministic, right? You also saw this with this interesting use of the LLM clients as part of the original Singularity attack. How do you do like real detection when everything on a system, right? You have your normal antivirus and sort of EDR systems, but when they just see your Claude client accessing files that are sensitive, they don't know what the input was. Was that my operator? Or was that a random script that came from NPM? How do you reason about that? To whether or not that's a healthy thing to be going on your machine. Another thing that I think becomes really important, right? I talked about this like 10 megabyte blob of obfuscated code that was a part of the Shai-Hulud worm. Well, of course, it was all obfuscated. The thing about open source is it's open. You can go and read it. Why do we have obfuscated code in open source? Like, does that make any sense? You can't audit that. So should NPM really be distributing obfuscated code? And then we also get to the question of binaries. We're seeing a lot more of those lately. They are even more difficult to kind of deal with. So yeah, that's something that I think is worth having a thought about. And then there's the question of what is the role of registries like NPM? Are they moderators? Do they make decisions about what they're willing to publish or not? Because right now, they do have a little bit of defenses, but it's not very much, right? It's really outsourced to companies like Aikido and other companies that are basically doing this job that I think you could argue maybe NPM should be doing this. I don't know. And I use the word moderator here very intentionally, right? Are you familiar with moderation rods from nuclear like silos and stuff? Like these rods that go down and it moderates the flow of like the neutrons and protons so that it sort of slows down a reaction. Well, when Shai-Hulud came out, we needed a moderator to slow things down. Whether that is by implementing delays or something else, having this kind of a little bit of a buffer for the ecosystem to catch up, that is something that needs to be thought about. And if they don't want to be in that role, then I think there's a question of how does the ecosystem kind of come together, right? Because everybody will catch different things to aggregate in a way of saying like, hey, there is a lot of these entities that actually think like this might be risky. And it's not that we will make a decision for you, but you get the information that you need to decide what risk are you willing to take. So what is trust? I trust you, maybe. Trust issues are real. For me, when I sat down and did these slides, I was like, okay, let's figure out what is trust. I think the most important thing about trust is that it's a consistency over time. And it's earned very slowly. I don't distrust Josh Junan just because he was fished once, right? I still believe in his intent because he's been so consistent over 10 years. And I also believe that he's got the same intent as me. He doesn't have a bad motive towards me or anybody. But attackers don't have a good intent. So obviously that's why you don't trust them. But really, what you start to see is that trust becomes really important under stress. The trust really starts to break at the edges of things that are normal. And whether it's account takeovers, it's people getting burned out, or just pressure in real life, they can't focus on what they like to do anymore, kids. That it's these edges of life that really expose us to these kind of compromises when good things turn bad. And we also have this thing of social amplification, where the fact that people are using these packages is because somebody else has decided. They see the download counter and go, Oh, 1 million downloads a week. It must be really trustworthy. But who's writing the code? So I think the most important thing, and wow, timing, holy Moses. I think what I've come down to is that trust is really what survives when conditions change. It's not when things are easy, right? And everything is, I think, really changed. The unfortunate reality is that a lot of what we see now going on, it's happening because we've kind of lost some of the sight to each other, the fact that these are other human beings. And NPM is actively being used to distribute things that are extremely harmful. So trust, like, people trusted that what was NPM was fine because they assumed good intent from other humans. But we can't really assume that anymore. You have to verify. So where do we go from here? I wish it was Q&A. Yeah, there was a lot of things to say. So I will be around afterwards. If you have any thoughts, questions, please come up. But yeah, thank you for your trust in being here. Hopefully it didn't get you too down.